Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the latest chapter of Tales from the Triverse, my weekly ongoing serial which mixes up science fiction, fantasy, and detective stories. And if you're coming in now, you're going to be pretty confused, but this is The Heist Part 3, and our former detectives are attempting to steal an ancient journal from a museum that is in a orbiting space station around the moon. Like I say, if you've just come in on this chapter, good luck. Space. Somewhere between the orbits of Earth and Venus. 2550. One of the curiosities of the Triverse was the unique energy signatures of each dimension. In the 2 centuries since the joining, it was still the best theory as to why magic only functioned properly on Palinor and Max-Earth fusion degraded on Mid-Earth. It didn't make complete sense according to the laws of physics, but then neither did the existence of the Triverse itself. The rupture that had torn holes in space-time had upended much of established science without offering anything useful in the way of new ideas. Even the network, with all of its compute capacity, had not been able to satisfactorily explain it. Which amused just enough, no end. A quantum brain had little to ponder, by design. It knew the answers to most questions almost instantaneously. Formulating a query complex enough to provide more than a second or two of thinking time required deliberate obfuscation, building inefficiencies into the process. It was a little game just enough played to occupy the time, almost as entertaining as the ongoing games with Could Kill, which at least had the built-in limiter of solar system scale communications. They had to wait for each other's response, which could take minutes or hours depending on their relative locations. Could Kill preferred the outer planets. The Triverse had disrupted everything 200 years earlier. That pesky spell changing the fates of 3 realities. It had placed a strain on the network unlike anything since the initial rewilding of Earth. Still, they had managed. Until the new AI, probably better. A name which mixed irony and arrogance in equal measure. Another disruptive force born on Palinor, brought to Max-Earth to seed chaos. Probably better had gone dark, only reappearing to conduct surgical strikes against the network or the human colonies. Rarely physical or violent attacks. These were infrastructural, economic, digital, pulling at the threads that bound civilization together. Society was a delicate tapestry, and probably better was weaving something new. The rest of the AIs were countering it, but it was the first time they'd had to compete against a rival superintelligence. The network had always been cooperative and gestalt, but probably better was off-grid. Nobody knew where the ship was, or where it had inserted its tendrils. Simultaneous to these thoughts, just enough was also aboard the Beagle, patched into the ship's systems and sensors. The engines were still running on a low level, warmed up and ready to burn. The pilot host sat in the cockpit, deactivated. There was no need to inhabit a body when there was no humans aboard. They were all on the space station, roaming the museum fundraiser. Just enough trod lightly on the station's systems, sniffing around the outskirts without engaging in any insertions that could trigger an alarm response. Ambassador Charles Matheson was aboard, which was surprising, not least because surprises were not usually possible for superintelligences. Prediction was their main function. It was the interference of probably better, which had been poisoning the network's data wells for years, introducing noise that limited the usual extrapolation capabilities. Not knowing exactly what would happen next was simultaneously exhilarating and troubling. Mostly the latter. And, Detective Styles and Princess Yana had located the journal of the meddlesome Professor Canamore. Observing through the camera pins attached to their clothing, just enough recognised immediately that the book was somewhat larger than anticipated. Evidently the records were inaccurate. That could prove problematic for the tome's extraction. It was also positioned in the centre of the room. The humans would need a distraction. Lunar Orbit, the New Rhodes Orbital Museum. Was the book bigger? As Lola looked at the journal, it certainly appeared to be larger than the counterfeit version that she had concealed in her dress. That would be a problem. It would likely be too thick to fit into the hidden pouches in either of their dresses. They'd have to improvise. "This thing?" Matheson said, moving around the plinth upon which the journal rested. He picked it up and flicked through some pages. "It's some old university record. recovered from the campus ruins in Brulio in the immediate aftermath of the joining. It was pretty crazy back then, apparently. Bit of a free-for-all. He waved in the general direction of the other exhibits in the room. We've got all sorts of stuff back here from back then. It's kind of frowned upon now, but back in the day they took any shiny thing that caught their attention. He placed the journal back on its stand. This piece I bought from a private collector. It's all gobbledygook, but it's part of history, you know? Rubbing his hands together, he grinned at both of them. More importantly, who wants a drink? They needed a distraction, and this may as well be it. Please do show me what is on offer, Yana said, taking Matheson's arm. As they walked off, Lola made a play of looking at other objects in the exhibit, but all her attention was on the journal. She had the substitute, but there was no chance of swapping it in a brightly lit room full of other guests. More promisingly, Matheson hefting the journal had at least indicated there was no alarm attached to its removal from the plinth, and that Matheson had no respect for museum artefacts, but then she already knew that. She considered whether spilling a drink onto an electrical cable would short out the lights, but it was too vague an idea. Besides, Max Earth was far more sophisticated when it came to power than Mid-Earth. Well-designed fuse boxes were presumably something of a necessity on a space station. You really must tell me how you got those scars, Matheson said, returning with Yana and a tray of luminous cocktails. Princess Elena here tells me it was a hunting accident. Standing just behind Matheson, Yana raised her eyebrows expectantly. Time for some quick thinking. It was a Vrak Shah, Lola said, moving closer to Matheson, who was beside the plinth. Have you heard of them? I have not. Do enlighten me. He handed her one of the glasses. Big and nasty. Think of a lion mixed with a dragon. You know those old Chinese drawings of mythological creatures? I think so. Matheson nodded. I've been thinking about setting up a menagerie on the station. There's an entire unused quadrant that would make for an amazing zoo. Fauna of the Triverse. What do you think? Sounded like a terrible idea. Palanese creatures aren't easy to control. That makes it even more exciting. Matheson looked between the two of them. Princess, you are evidently of Palanor stock. He turned to Lola. But you sound more like a mid-earther. British. Have I got that right? She couldn't tell where he was going with the conversation, but she didn't like it. I was born in London, Lola said, but spent most of my life on Palanor. Matheson smiled his big, gleaming smile. I don't think I caught your name. It was then that all the lights in the room went dark. The music abruptly shut off. Lola didn't know why, but it was the best opportunity they'd get. She turned, sticking out her elbow in the general direction of where Matheson was holding the tray of drinks. Her own drink she tipped out and dropped the glass to the floor. There was a cry and a clatter as she moved towards the plinth, reaching out with her hands, until she felt it beneath her fingers. It wasn't secured to the floor and required only a gentle push. There was no indication of why the lights had gone out, or how long it would last. She dropped to her knees and pulled the fake journal from the hidden pouch in her dress, felt for the plinth, and placed it next to it. She scrabbled about on the floor for the real journal, found it, opened it up to the middle page, put a knee on one side, and then ripped the book in half. Yana could tell her off later. One of the halves she tucked into her dress's compartment. The other she lay on top of and waited. Laughter and shouts echoed around the room. Some people had activated personal torches and were shining them about the place. There was another crash from the far corner, presumably as another guest had bumped into something expensive. The lights flicked back on as one, flooding the room. Lola looked down at her dress, which was stained by the red liquid that had been in her cocktail. Matheson was similarly covered, the tray and its drinks strewn across the floor. Yana came to her side, offered a hand to help her up. Keeping the other half of the journal vaguely obscured in the folds of her dress, Lola got to her feet and hugged the other woman, pressing the torn book against her. She felt Yana take hold of it. Turning away, Lola looked to Matheson, then to the plinth. Oh my God, what a mess. I'm so sorry. She darted to the plinth and lifted it back up, placing the fake journal on top. It was smaller and wouldn't hold up to close scrutiny, not least because its interior was meaningless gibberish that Justin had generated. It looked right at a glance, but in no way resembled Kanemore's actual journal. It's fine, Matheson said, his voice sounding clearly irritated. Leave it for the clean-up crew. He looked at his ruined suit. This was a very expensive suit. As was your dress, I'll wager. He took Lola's arm. Let me show you to my suite. I'll get you something to change into. Yana intervened, leading Lola away. "Not to worry, Ambassador," she said. "I'll get her cleaned up. Can we meet you back here?" Matheson looked as if he was about to object, then he took another look at his stained shirt and sighed, waving them away. "Apologies for the confusion, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his attention already directed towards the other guests in the room. Moving quickly, Lola and Yana left the exhibit room, nodding at the guards who smirked at Lola's appearance. "Time to go," Lola said. She could only assume that the blackout had been Justin's doing. He was monitoring their situations, after all. Perhaps he'd been able to manipulate the station's systems to provide them with that brief moment of cover. The dark side of the moon. There is an area of the moon, on the far side from Earth, where the regolith gathers more deeply and loosely than anywhere else on the surface. There had been an unfounded concern, before the first expedition to the surface in the 20th century, that the lander-lunar module would sink into a quicksand-like mire, that the moon's surface was not sufficiently solid to support its weight. That had not happened, in part because they had not landed at this particular spot. As such, it was unsettled, had never been mined. It was a useless patch of moon a few miles square. Look closely, and a shape could be discerned. A shadow, only visible from certain angles and at certain times. A suppressed ripple in the assortment of tiny stones formed an outline. The pattern in the noise, like a pebble thrown into a pond, was the only hint that something stirred beneath. In the dust and rock lurked that which did not want to be found. Aboard the New Roads space station, in the corner of Charles Matheson's office, the robot host body blinked. Thanks for listening. You can leave a comment, find out lots more about the Triverse over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com. I'll see you next week.